Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and you're very, very welcome to our lecture tonight. I hope some of you had a look at the treaty exhibition as you came in, and if you didn't, by all means have a look before you go out. It is definitely excellent, and we're absolutely delighted to be able to cooperate with the National Archives on this touring exhibition, which is the first time that National Archives has done anything like this. And we are one of the 6 local authorities with which they are cooperating. And tonight's lecture is part of the treaty exhibition, the whole package, and on your behalf and my behalf and Tipperary County Council Archives behalf, we would be delighted to welcome Dr. Leeann Lane. Dr. Lane is a lecturer in the School of History and Geography in DCU and a member of the Expert Advisory Group on Centenary Commemorations, which was established in 2011 by the Taoiseach. She has written books on Rosamund Jacob and Dorothy McArdle, and she is presently working on a biography of Mary MacSwiney. So we are in the very privileged position to hear the lecture before the book is actually published. So no doubt we'll be all queuing up to buy the book when it is published. So ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I welcome Leeann.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to Rachel for the invitation to speak. And thank you, everybody, for turning out. So I think what I'm going to try to do today is try to understand Mary MacSwiney, the person, rather than just Mary MacSwiney, the individual who seemed to just become a cipher for extreme republicanism. She was a human being, so I want to try to negotiate, what she felt, why she felt it, etc. By her own admission, Mary MacSwiney was no longer a young woman when her brother Terence died in Brixton jail on the 25th of October 1920. Yet it was from this period onwards that she began to assume a progressively more important role in Irish politics, tentatively at first, as many of the male politicians saw her only as a mourning sister, while others, such as De Valera, were circumspect about the merits of women in the political arena. A somewhat inflated report on her reception in America during the period of her 1920-1921 tour read, quote, "Miss MacSwiney has risen during the few months she has been in America from comparative obscurity to one of the most widely known women in the country and has been accorded receptions in nearly 100 American cities that can be compared only with those given great world leaders," end quote. Taking De Valera's place in America in leading the Republican bond drive was at his special request, as MacSwiney reminded him in July 1921. Recalling the request, she stated that she obeyed, quote, "as a soldier of Ireland, though only a woman." While in America, Mary MacSwiney was elected unopposed to the second Dáil, one of the 4 Sinn Féin representatives for Cork City. On the 16th of August 1921, the first meeting of that Dáil was held, and Mary MacSwiney wasn't actually present because she was en route back from America. But in that first week, the week that the first meeting in the same week as the first meeting of the second Dáil was held, Talbot Press issued Principles of Freedom, a collection of essays by Terence MacSwiney dedicated to, quote, soldiers of freedom in every land. Terence MacSwiney's death for his political principles, I would argue, informed his sister's response to the instructions given to the plenipotentiaries, the guarantees demanded, and the treaty that ensued. Mary MacSwiney returned repeatedly to Terence's writings, and his words permeated and suffused hers as she stood during the treaty debates, often to male ridicule and male sneering, as she stood resolutely and indefatigably for, quote, a republic that cannot die. Ireland would not, she declared in a speech in Cork in September 1921, lower the flag for which our martyrs have died. Mary MacSwiney experienced trauma in Brixton in 1920 and entered into a cycle of repetition compulsion that revolved around making meaningful the death of her brother. Her brother's death was the reason that she would go on during the Civil War to endure 2 grueling hunger strikes in November 1922 in Mountjoy and again in April 1923 in Kilmainham. Terence MacSwiney's death was also the reason why she could not countenance Eamon de Valera's decision to enter parliamentary politics in 1926 when he founded Fianna Fáil. It was also the reason why she left Cumann in 1933, or one of the reasons why she left Cumann in 1933 when it removed from its constitution allegiance to, quote, the Declaration of Independence of January 1919 and all that followed from it, end quote. The effects of the trauma Mary MacSwiney suffered as a witness to her brother's death can be gleaned from the rare outbursts of emotion she exhibited in the Dáil chamber as she spoke against the treaty. She spoke for over 2.5 hours, and that was longer than the 5 plenipotentiaries spoke in total. It was the longest speech of the treaty debates. And she was aware of the growing mood of frustration, but she defied the irritation of her audience. I care not if I take more of your time than you are willing to give. Her anguish was palpable when she appealed to the House, quote, against the sneers of Arthur Griffith, claiming her right to speak at length on the basis of, quote, what she went through for 74 days at Brixton. Her distress was also patently evident in her correspondence with Eamon de Valera during this period, and I'll return to that at a later point. In her recent article on killing in the War of Independence, the historian Anne Dolan states that the soldiers' voices have long been the obvious ones. She makes the case instead for wider tales of trauma and victimhood. Quote, for the witnesses who saw and stood by, for those who watched, for those who identified corpses, who went from wives to widows in the space of a few words before a coroner or a military court, for those who witnessed Ireland's kind of war, but not as soldiers or combatants, or victims or participants in the sense that the history of killing has become accustomed to. In discussing accounts of violence, Dolan is concerned to introduce what she describes as another set of voices, the voices of those who were often the first to set the terms of how violence was understood, but who went back after the inquests to whatever lives, occupations, households that their testimony gave only fleeting glimpses of. Now, Mary MacSwiney did not fall out of the historical record, as did the individuals that Dolan discusses. She did not return to her life as before her brother's death, but still Dolan's argument is apposite in considering her experience as a witness of a certain form of violent death during the War of Independence, the death of a brother on hunger strike. Ian Miller writes that the hunger strikes of the revolutionary period could be, quote, construed as a form of violence being used by a government who had alternative options available, such as recommending early release or granting concessions. Annie MacSwiney wrote of Terence's last week. It was, quote, agonizing to see all the pain and struggle, to see him helpless in their hands being subject to such torture. Her declaration that, quote, none of us will ever forget the horror of that place, Brixton Jail, is vital in understanding the response of Mary MacSwiney to the treaty and in critiquing her later political stance. The psychic or psychological effect on the families of men who died on hunger strike has not been considered in any great depth within Irish historiography. In 2001, Paul Lerner and Mark McCall noted, quote, that the study of trauma has begun to inspire a rapidly growing historical dimension. Now, Graham Dawson does identify certain issues with trauma theory within the humanities, and in his work on post-conflict Northern Ireland makes a case for shifting the frame for investigation of subjective experiences and psychological legacies of the conflict away from trauma and towards the history and memory of emotions. The extent to which Mary MacSwiney's experience can be labelled as trauma, of course, does need to be interrogated. The American Psychiatric Association defines PSTD, recognised since the 1980s as, quote, an event out of the range of ordinary human experience in which one's lives or the lives of one's family are endangered. Now, at one level, hunger strikes and their potential consequences were not extraordinary events for Mary MacSwiney. As a suffrage activist, she was familiar with suffragette hunger strikes. the hunger strikes that began in England in 1909 and in Ireland in 1912. Yet there was something unspeakable in Mary MacSwiney's experience of her brother's hunger strike, because he did believe that he would be released. As William Murphy writes, prison, as it had 2 years earlier, appeared to be on the verge of worthlessness as a weapon against the IRA. The hunger strikers of Cork, including Terence MacSwiney, therefore had good reason to believe that they would not be obliged to choose between abandoning their strike and death. As late as the 25th of September 1920, Terence MacSwiney was discussing the possibility of moving to a nursing home should the government release him. 2 days earlier, Mary MacSwiney expressed her confidence and willingness to have him remain in Brixton under Dr. Hickston's care should his release be ordered until he was fit to be moved. That her brother was not released but died after such agonizing suffering elevated the hunger strike to something extraordinary, and I think does allow us to think about trauma in the context of what Mary MacSwiney experienced. Mary MacSwiney, I want to argue, was not merely a cipher for the extreme element within republicanism during the treaty debates and later. She was a human being. She was a woman who had suffered ultimate loss and witnessed, in the words of her sister Annie, scenes that were agonizing beyond anything I could describe. On the 20th of September, while in discussion with one of the medical officers in Brixton, Dr. Griffiths, she did become, as he put it, argumentative. But he also noted that she, quote, wept and said it was harder to see him suffering than to take his place. He continued, quote, she seemed to become genuinely distressed and begged me not to ask her or any one of them again to induce her brother to take food. It is, of course, clear that MacSwiney was a strong Republican, a strong woman, irrespective of the experience of the trauma of her brother's death. Her politics very much aligned with his. Colonel Lambert, commandant at Frongok in 1916, declared that she was a mischief maker. MacSwiney was forced to assume a strong personality due to family circumstances. It could be argued, indeed, that she had already experienced a number of traumatic events before that of Brixton 1920. And those earlier traumatic events, in turn, determined her response to the death of her brother. Going back to her childhood, her father, John MacSwiney, lacked a business instinct, and with the collapse of his tobacco business enterprise in Cork, he decided to emigrate to Australia in 1885, with the intention of sending for his family once he established himself. He failed to thrive in Australia, dying in Melbourne 10 years later in 1895. Remaining in Cork, his wife was forced to make difficult choices. Indeed, she was pregnant when her husband left Ireland, giving birth to Sean MacSwiney 6 months later. And Sean MacSwiney was actually a TD in the second Dáil with his sister Mary, but didn't have the same high profile as Mary. In the words of Annie MacSwiney, it was a grim family struggle in this period after her father left for Australia. The family moved from King Street to the infinitely less salubrious Blarney Street to take over the running of a shop. Its cheapness was its attraction. The shop failed, and the family moved further down the street to rent in a 3-flat house. The writer and Republican Frank O'Connor, who lived in Blarney Street until he was 5 years old, summed up the prevailing wretchedness in his 1961 memoir, An Only Child. Blarney Street, begins at the foot of Shandon Street, near the riverbank, in sordidness, and ascends the hill to something like squalor. From the period of her father's departure to Australia, Mary MacSwiney had to shoulder obligations that devolved to her as the eldest sibling. In her unpublished memoir of her sister, Annie MacSwiney declared, quote, Máire was only 15 years when Papa left home, and though so young, she seemed even then to rise to meet and bridge the loneliness in Mama's life. Such sentimental hyperbole aside, MacSwiney's assumption of responsibility for family members was a key pattern in her life from this point, influencing both personal and political choices going forward. At the same time, she experienced life-changing health issues. an untreated incident on the day of her first communion resulted at a later point in the amputation of her big toe, necessitating a lengthy and difficult hospital stay. Her sister Annie wrote, "Great delicacy resulted from the infection, and at one point spent almost a year in hospital, during which time she was threatened by complete loss of sight. For months she lay with covered eyes and night after night had terrifying nightmares." At aged 18, after a number of years, quote, of suffering, MacSwiney's foot had to be amputated from the ankle joint. In 1914, just as she accepted a teaching post in the Benedictine convent in Ventnor, Isle of Wight, news of her mother's impending death reached her. Returning to Ireland, she immediately assumed the role of head of the family, a role that she would maintain throughout the rest of her life. She organised the educational plans for all relevant siblings for the year ahead before returning to her post in Ventnor. She remained in this position for 2 years while, quote, keeping her hands on the reins and her finger on the pulse of home life in Cork. After 2 years, she, quote, determined to be with us altogether, Annie wrote. This role as head of the MacSwiney family, in charge of the, quote, direction of the home life, influenced her response to Terence's death. She witnessed not just a brother's death, but the protracted suffering of a brother to whom she had assumed a maternal role. On the 12th of August 1920, Terence MacSwiney was arrested at City Hall, Cork, with 10 other men. 4 days later, he was charged under Regulation 224 of the Defence of the Realm Act with possession of an RIC cipher and under Regulation 27 with possession of 2 documents, quote, likely to cause disaffection to His Majesty. As he was on hunger strike, he declared to the court he would be, quote, free, alive or dead within a month. At 2:30 on the morning of the 17th of August, he was transferred to London in line with the government's, quote, new hardline policy aimed at repressing IRA violence. This was a policy implemented from mid-1920, including, as William Murphy discusses, quote, their attempt to re-establish the credibility of imprisonment as a weapon, end quote. Continuing his hunger strike, MacSwiney was placed in the prison hospital in Brixton jail. As noted, William Murphy states that, quote, despite the rhetoric of death, Terence MacSwiney believed that he would be released at the last moment, and his family did believe that really right up until the end. And it is important, however, though, to balance that belief with the lived experience, the all-consuming fear and, indeed, increasing reality of death that the MacSwiney family endured for 74 days. And it is necessary to consider the long-lasting impact of that ordeal. A headline in the Freeman's Journal on the 20th of August read, quote, Máire faces death, and stated that Muriel MacSwiney, Terence's wife, had received a brief letter from her husband asking her to be ready to cross to England on short notice. The shadow of a great tragedy is surely deepening, the paper declared. As Miller notes, many at this point still believed that death could occur within a matter of days of hunger striking. So there's very little medical knowledge about hunger striking in this period. On the 2nd of September, it was recorded in his medical notes that he may die at any moment and would not be likely in any case to survive more than a few days. Geoffrey Whiscord wrote to the Home Office on the 20th of September 1920 in respect of, quote, the legal questions which will arise as to the custody and ownership of the body. Mary MacSwiney's telegram on the 19th of August from Cork to the governor of Brixton Prison and to her brother yielded no replies. She then sent a telegram to the Home Office, receiving the reply that as her brother was continuing to refuse food, he was, quote, beginning to show signs of consequent weakness. On that same day, she left for England. When MacSwiney reached Brixton, her brother had passed the 7-day period, after which, as Miller discusses, emotional changes become evident in the hunger striker. During the strike in the Gormanstown internment camp in October 1923, a number of men were ordered not to strike, but to be ready to provide nursing and other care to those that were on strike as they weakened. Sean Prendergast's record of the effect of the strike on men as they entered the second week of hunger striking in Gormanstown, can be used to gauge what Mary MacSwiney witnessed when, following an overnight cross-channel journey, she first saw her brother in Brixton. The awful pathos, the cruel drama, the immense tragedy that hunger striking effort manifested. A drink, please, from the parched lips of one who was growing weaker with the passing of time conveyed a message that meant more than the words implied. The owner was losing his grip on life and moving slowly yet steadily on the ebb tide. It must also be remembered that Terence had undergone a sea voyage while on hunger strike that may have expedited his decline. Thomas Tracy describes his voyage from Belfast in April 1920, when he, together with upwards of 100 men, was transferred to Wormwood Scrubs by boat. He wrote, "The sea voyage on hunger strike was a big ordeal. We were handcuffed in pairs, and nearly all, including myself, got seasick. The empty retching under these circumstances was much more racking than ordinary seasickness." Maurice Crowe, who was transferred to Winchester Jail from Cork in August 1920, in and around the same time as Terence was transferred to Brixton, stated that the prisoners were, quote, "not even given a drink of water during the voyage. When they arrived at Pembroke, after an 18-hour journey, some of the men were so weak that they had to be taken on stretchers to the awaiting train." Father Dominic, Terence MacSwiney's chaplain, noted that he had been on hunger strike more than 107 hours when he was placed on board a British government naval sloop and transported to England. He arrived in Brixton prison at 4 a.m. on 18th of August. Art O'Brien, the representative of the Irish Republic in London, referred to the effects of, quote, "the long sea journey" on MacSwiney in a memo to Michael Collins, noting also that MacSwiney was, quote, "a man starting with all the disadvantages of a rundown system." On the 20th of August, the day of Mary MacSwiney's arrival, Higson, one of the medical officers in Brixton, wrote, quote, "The prisoner is now showing definite signs of exhaustion from his refusal to take food." Mary MacSwiney saw her brother twice on the 20th of August. Father Dominic recalled that she sent a telegram to Muriel, her sister-in-law, stating that her brother, Muriel's husband, was, quote, "in a grave condition and that she should cross to England without delay." Father Dominic accompanied Muriel across the Channel that night, Mary meeting them in Paddington Station. On that same day, the 20th of August, in the company of Art O'Brien, Mary MacSwiney called to see the Secretary of State. She was not given an audience, but instead she was given an audience with Sir Ernley Blackwell, legal assistant and Under Secretary of State at the Home Office. William Murphy states that that day, the 20th of August, was a frantic day when, as he puts it, both sides staked out their fatal positions. The centrality of Mary MacSwiney in this context has been underestimated in the historiography. Blackwell stated that at the meeting that he held with her on the 20th of August, she, quote, "used very violent language against the government and the Secretary of State." But it is noteworthy that he also stated that Mr. O'Brien said very little. In other words, she was dominating proceedings. Following this meeting, she wrote to the Home Secretary, Sir Edward Short, noting that Blackwell had informed her, quote, "that it is the final decision of the British government to let my brother and his comrades die in prison," end quote. Her tone in the letter was assertive and to the point. She requested an interview and stated that before she saw him, she wanted to impress certain matters on him. It was Mary MacSwiney, not Art O'Brien, who laid out Terence MacSwiney's position. "If you let my brother die, or any of his comrades die in prison, we shall hold you personally responsible for murder. We are not accustomed to bluff. What we say, we mean. So if you imagine that any of these men is bluffing and will take food at the end, you are mistaken." Now, in the context of the gender roles of the period, where women were supposed to be docile and within the home, submissive, etc., Mary MacSwiney's refusal to adopt a supplicatory position in her dealings with prison staff, the medical officers who attended her brother, and government officials such as Blackwell and Short, meant that she came across as a difficult woman who did not know her place. While it is very likely that she did express her hatred for the British government in no uncertain terms during her meeting with Blackwell, the extent to which her language was violent must be contextualised through the lens of gender? Would it have been dubbed violent if it was language issued by a man? Griffiths, the medical officer in Brixton, or one of the medical officers, did note after an interview with her on the 18th of September that, quote, she seemed from her general conversation to have a bitterly anti-British bias. Anti-British language was certainly typical of MacSwiney's lexicon, but how far she engaged in violent language does need to be interrogated. Annie MacSwiney maintained a diary of the last week of her brother's hunger strike. You can read it online. Margaret Lucy, who gave a copy to the Bureau of Military History, stated it would, quote, convey some idea of the courage and devotion shown by members of his family who were close by him during the final days of his martyrdom. Ian Miller states that hunger striking is, quote, an intensely personal act involving a body in distress. The hunger strike of Terence MacSwiney, however, can in some respects be described as a familial act, as his wife and siblings bore witness, and in the context of the latter, encouraged him to persevere to the end. Dr. Peddard, another of the doctors who attended him, told Mary MacSwiney that Terence was developing scurvy and advised lime juice. Other physical manifestations of malnutrition included weakening eyesight, and he suffered from painful bones, and they brought in a waterbed at one point to try to ease his distress. Now, in her Bureau of Military History witness statement, Muriel, his wife, she stated, quote, I naturally tried to save Terry's life. She said she did not resent, but rather understood the assistant prison doctor who asked her to encourage her husband to take food. Her stance was not that of Mary MacSwiney or indeed Annie MacSwiney. Neither Mary nor Annie were willing to encourage their brother to end the strike. In this, they were true, of course, to what he wrote in his essay, Womanhood. Quote, how is the woman training for tomorrow? With clinging arms hold him back, or proud ones wave him on. When Mary MacSwiney informed one of the doctors that her brother's fate was in God's hands, Peddard sharply retorted, quote, that it was not, it was in ours. Prendergast writes that as strikers fell prey to emaciation and hallucinations in Gormanstown internment camp in October 1923, stick it out, boys, stick it out, was a commonplace slogan in use during that period. It held meaning for us. I'm quoting Prendergast. Stick it out, boys, stick it out was a commonplace slogan in use during that period and had been so for quite a long time. It held meaning for us in those days when our endurance was tested. Stick it out, boys became a watchword, a password, a virtual slogan of defiance. Michael O'Donoghue, IRA Cork 2nd Battalion, recalled that during the Cork hunger strike in 1920, crowds in their thousands assembled nightly outside the prison and prayed and sang to strengthen the spirits of the men refusing food within. And despite the fact that her unwillingness to encourage, that Mary MacSwiney's unwillingness to encourage her brother to give up his hunger strike was very much then part of that collective Republican response, the criticism that was levelled at her was very gendered in tone. MacSwiney, as a woman, was expected to nurture and care under the gender roles of the period. She was certainly not expected to be taking on the patriarchal establishment, so that gives her the kind of label of being very difficult. But the reality is that men were in Cork encouraging the hunger strikers to continue on. When Mary MacSwiney is not doing that in Brixton, she's labelled problematic. Taking on the patriarchal establishment, as she did in Brixton, was considered transgressive, as arguably also was her lengthy speech in the Dáil in December 1921 against the treaty. In his medical report on the 23rd of October, Griffiths wrote, quote, Miss Mary MacSwiney asked to see me last night and behaved in an extremely unpleasant and disorderly manner in my room. She was, he wrote, troublesome. So she was negotiating on behalf of her brother. If a man was doing that negotiation, I would suggest he wouldn't be labelled troublesome, but because she was a woman, she was subject to such labels. Indeed, when she visited her brother in Fronguk in 1916, the Home Office declared that, quote, she used language which, had she been a man and not a woman, would have resulted in her being handed over to the police under the Defence of the Realm Act. So there's a lot of gendered kind of responses to Mary MacSwiney which need to be teased out. The criticism that Mary MacSwiney was strident, unyielding, and transgressive arguably also informed the negative attitude that began to emerge towards her amongst certain of those on the Republican side during the treaty debates. In the debate on the ratification of the plenipotentiaries on the 14th of September 1921, MacSwiney declared in the Dáil, quote, "If there were people who did believe in compromise, let them now say what they had to say, or forevermore hold their peace," end quote. There were those who adopted a dismissive tone towards her. Ernest Blythe, of course, never really known for his feminism. Ernest Blythe recalled that following that speech, she, quote, "wound up pointing her finger directly at me. I only laughed at her." In the last week of his hunger strike, Terence MacSwiney's family watched as he became quite unlike himself. Much was made following his death of his politeness to his doctors. However, his medical notes actually show that he suffered from irritability, understandably. On the 20th of October, Dr. Griffith noted that he is becoming sulky and unpleasant in his manner. On the 28th of the month, Griffiths wrote that he, quote, "seemed rather depressed and sullen this morning." Those words, sullen, depressed, were used repeatedly to describe his demeanour, and this must have taken its toll on family members. It's really quite unlikely that he was just irritable with the doctors. He probably was irritable with family members as well, as he was inching towards death. On his last Wednesday, he was, Annie MacSwiney recorded, on the verge of delirium, constantly struggling against the fear that he would be at the doctor's mercy and given sustenance if unconscious. He became transfixed by knocking in the prison yard, interpreting it in his increasing delirium as the doctor's new treatment. It was, he told Annie, evidence of international importance. The family witnessed him striking out at those who came near to him. He was shouting loudly and trying to get out of bed, and this must have been so distressing to watch. But he was so emaciated, of course, that it was very easy, Annie wrote, to overcome him. Again, just going back to the hunger strike in Gormanstown in 1923, October, Prendergast referred to the poor, emaciated frames that were once strong bodies, once healthy, active human beings. Prendergast referred to the, quote, strain on and the anxiety experienced by the men who helped those on strike. Indeed, Prendergast stated, we who tended them were perhaps more disturbed. Hunger strikers became, quote, disfigured as their bodies fell prey to extreme malnutrition. Descent into death was slow and painful. And the effect on those family members and others watching cannot be underestimated. As Prendergast wrote, quote, the painful scenes that we witnessed then were enough to affect one's nerves. Prendergast wrote of the, quote, dread shadow of death that hung close to many participants after the strikers passed 15 days. If Prendergast was, as he wrote, at the limit of endurance at 15 days, the distress experienced by the MacSwiney family must have been so much the greater as Terence neared 70 days without food. Ian Miller states that hunger strikers inflict pain and suffering upon their healthy bodies and refuse medical intervention. They manipulate and damage their own bodies for a broader political purpose. Michael O'Donoghue described Terence MacSwiney's body as it lay in state in a coffin in Cork City Hall. O'Donoghue formed part of the rotating IRA six-man guard of honour and recalled, beneath the glass cover lay the shrunken corpse, the face small, pinched, but very serene. The most striking feature of the body was its smallness, like a child of 12. The folds of the uniform piteously accentuated the mummy-like contour of the corpse. From the parchment pallor of the face and hands, it seemed as if the whole body had not alone been drained of blood, but dehydrated as well. And this was Terence. This was the last photograph taken of Terence. And, you know, you can see there he's a relatively healthy, youngish man, quite a pleasant-looking man, I would suggest. And within just a couple of months, within this was taken in May 1920, he was arrested in August, so by October, he's literally, his corpse is like a child of 12. And I think it is, and I know I'm stressing this, but I think it is important to consider the emotional effect on the family as they watched a healthy, vibrant, relatively young man starve himself to the point where he became so emaciated as to look like a child of 12. You can see there, maybe more clearly, as clear as we can get, his body. This is when he was lying in state in Southwark Cathedral in London. You can see it maybe a little better than the photograph of the body in Cork. You can, I think, kind of see how small the corpse is. In her reference to an uncompromising minority in the September debate on the plenipotentiaries and the necessity to suffer to bring forth the Republic, Mary MacSwiney was not just drawing, of course, on her own experience of trauma at watching her brother endure a protracted and agonising death. She was also bearing witness to his beliefs. Terence MacSwiney wrote of the men who held the breach, who knew they stood for the truth, against which nothing can prevail. And if they had to endure struggle, suffering and pain, they had the finer knowledge born of those things. As the peace talks began in London, the Abbey Theatre staged Terence MacSwiney's The Revolutionist, published and set in 1914. Prophetically, the play's central theme was the necessity for individual self-sacrifice in the form of death to bring about national unity. On the first day of the peace talks, Peace Conference in London, crowds of Irish sympathisers assembled at the end of Downing Street, approached by the Irish delegates. Hymns were sung, the rosary was recited, and flags waved, quote, in scenes of wild enthusiasm. As the crowd shouted out the names of prominent Irishmen, Terence MacSwiney was, quote, spoken of reverently. In letters, pages long, to De Valera, Mary MacSwiney betrayed her emotional response. So she wrote to De Valera as the peace talks were occurring. Adopting a supplicatory tone, not something you expect from Mary MacSwiney, she requested that, quote, he would not be angry with her for writing to him in the way she has. She implored him for guarantees. Don't you think, she wrote, it would be nice of you to show me you are magnanimous by sending me a line of assurance just for me that our envoys will not come back with any plan of Ireland inside the empire. End quote. She enclosed poems written by her brother. She sent him Principles of Freedom with marked passages, which she beseeched him to read. She recalled the agony of her family, this time 12 months ago. They had to, she wrote to De Valera, face and count the cost daily and hourly. And I think that's really important. It is really important to try to put ourselves in the minds of these human beings who were literally sitting at the bedside of a man who was dying on hunger strike. They had to, she said, face and count the cost daily and hourly. There was time for searching analysis, time to explore every avenue of compromise, and having rejected them, time to pray that sacrifice might give strength to all others, to endure to the end and give our cause final triumph. In her speech during the debate on the treaty, MacSwiney stated that she spoke as a woman who, quote, realises as only a woman can the evils of war and the suffering of war. There were, however, she stated, evils worse than war. With every sense of deep responsibility, she declared, let us take war. In her speech, she offered herself to the other side of the House as, quote, one of the first and most deliberate and irreconcilable rebels, if this country should be so false to itself to adopt the so-called treaty. Her speech was based also, though, on principle. She denounced those who argued that they would accept the treaty but would not take the oath. This, she argued, was cowardice, a defilement of, as she put it, the noble and spiritual ideal of the Republic. A person could not, she stated, quote, be at the same time faithful and unfaithful. Moreover, England would not, she stated, allow any such prevarications. She exhorted deputies not to think they could, quote, get the better of that wizard trickster in Downing Street, Lord George. MacSwiney refused to accept that she was either, quote, a fool or willfully blind in not considering the very act of negotiation a compromise. Michael Collins, she contended, declared to her that he was no compromiser. Having previously trusted the delegates too much, she moved in December to indict them for betrayal. The issue of the will of the people was also integral to MacSwiney's speech. Her constituents, she declared, knew what she stood for when she was elected. Now, it is important to remember that she was elected unopposed. She had not changed, nor would she stated. Invoking her brother's writing, MacSwiney declared that it was, quote, not those who can inflict most, but those who can endure most will conquer. Appealing to the legitimacy of Republican martyrs, she stated if Sean McKeown, who had seconded what she described as abominable document, were her brother, I would rather he was with Kevin Barry. In her rejection of the treaty, MacSwiney echoed her brother's concept of working for, as he wrote, a future that only other generations will enjoy. Denouncing, as she put it, the flippancy of Kevin O'Higgins, she stated, I should like to be as young as Deputy O'Higgins is now to carry on the fight for posterity. As she wrote privately to De Valera, I claim that the daily torture of unspeakable suffering gives me a claim to speak. Her brother's agony would never, she wrote to De Valera, have been endured to the end for anything less than absolute and entire separation. Elizabeth Brennan, secretary to Art O'Brien, underestimated Mary MacSwiney's strength of conviction. Brennan stated, I know that Mary MacSwiney spent several hours with him, Art O'Brien. I would imagine that he poisoned her mind against it, the treaty. No one poisoned Mary MacSwiney's mind. Rather, it had narrowed itself around the trauma of her brother's hunger strike. Mary MacSwiney's uncompromising stance in the treaty negotiations was indelibly formed by the experiences of watching her brother die in hunger strike and the trauma that resulted from it. She witnessed an intimate act of self-sacrifice which bound her to a belief that her task was to continue her brother's fidelity to a separatist republic. Betrayal of the republic for her would mean betrayal of a brother she loved and admired, and it would have been almost impossible for her to think and feel in any other way. Thank you.